On this episode of Faith in Focus, I want to discuss what everyone else in America and around the world is talking about. This Roe v. Wade leak that has happened, but more importantly, I obviously want to talk about just about the issue of abortion, because I've been thinking about it, obviously, like everyone else has for the past couple weeks. And I just want to share some of my thoughts on that issue and why I view this issue, like many others, as a crucial divide in our country's history moving forward. This is very much similar to kind of 1850s and 60s America. This issue of slavery back then was a crucial divide in American history. And I really think abortion and women's rights, this whole issue, is another one of those divides. So I want to talk about that, some of the thoughts I've been having on that, and kind of maybe a biblical worldview and how that plays into this issue. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, as you are well aware, unless you've been living under a rock, our country has been scrambling for the past couple of weeks dealing with this leak that has come out from what sounds like a clerk in the Supreme Court, a clerk of one of the Supreme Court justices. Seems like they have leaked out what now appears to be, I think it's all but confirmed, a legitimate majority opinion. The court heard a case that would challenge Roe v. Wade and this issue of abortions and women's rights and that whole issue, and they had a majority opinion that looks and appears as if it's going to overrule Roe v. Wade. Now, obviously, I am not in any way a legal scholar, so kind of put an asterisk next to everything that I'm saying about all of this legal stuff, because I really have no idea what I'm talking about any more than you do if you're reading up on these issues. But I do try to read and listen to people who know what they're talking about in this issue. So I feel like I'm a little bit informed on some of these issues. That's what my hope is, anyways. But what I guess it sounds like what has happened is this case that has come before the Supreme Court. It's built on these other assumptions. It's kind of this idea in legal jurisprudence called precedent. You know, if a court makes one ruling, that sets a precedent for further rulings that are built on top of that. That's why sometimes, like you or I, people who know nothing about the law might look at in an amendment in the Constitution that a law is based off of, and we think, how did they get that from that constitutional amendment or that right that's guaranteed in the Constitution? Well, it's because these precedents get set throughout American history, and it's kind of like any institution where these things that kind of grow, these growths that crop up on the institution over time, just things start to get glom onto the institution. Well, these precedents start to build on. So if one court decides, well, you know, in this really ambiguously worded constitutional amendment, we have determined that this guarantees a right to X, Y, and Z. Well, then another court further down the line will look back and say, well, they will not only look at the constitutional amendment, but they'll look at how the court has interpreted that in the past and say, well, there is precedent, there's previous decisions that have been made based on this, so based on those precedents, we're going to decide this, and then on and on it goes. And as I understand it, Roe v. Wade and this whole issue around abortion is built on like 3 or 4 different previous court precedents. So it's kind of this whole scaffolding that has built up around these rights of privacy, these rights to due process, and things that you look at and say, well, that doesn't seem like it says anything about abortion. Well, it's because those constitutional rights, those amendments, don't say anything about abortion. It's how courts over the years have interpreted those amendments that have kind of built onto that. So now the problem we're faced with now in our country is we have essentially a Supreme Court majority that is basically saying all of those, not all, but those precedents that have been set in the past, those were wrongly adjudicated. Those were decided wrongly. Now, that it seems shocking that we would be like, well, wait a second, you can't just decide that the Supreme Court is the court that decides the law, decides the legality of laws that are passed. They're the ultimate authority. How could they be wrong? And it sounds like an incredible miscarriage of justice that a Supreme Court would just throw out and just utterly upturn the tables like this. But it's not really that unreasonable to think about, because again, if you think of from the pro-life position, we would look back and say, well, a decision that was made that allowed for abortion was a wrong decision, and that this is just righting the wrong that was made previously. And if you're pro-choice, you would look back and say the choice to allow abortion was the right decision, and this court is making the wrong decision. So no matter what side of the fence you're on this abortion issue, you realize the Supreme Court can make wrong decisions. Well, if the Supreme Court makes one wrong decision, and then a succeeding court 20, 30 years later makes another decision based on that wrong decision, and then another court makes another decision based on those two wrong decisions, if you challenge the fundamental wrong decision that was made initially, that whole thing comes crashing down. Which it sounds like some of the people I've been listening to think that that's what Clarence Thomas's hope is he's challenging this whole 100 years worth of precedent that has been set, and this whole idea of how the right to privacy has been interpreted. Now, I think the reason why we have such a sharp divide in our country right now over this issue is because both sides have a different view of such a foundational issue, that all of the assumptions that then get extrapolated from those differences of opinions on foundational issues, of course we're not going to agree because we disagree on a fundamental principle. Now, this fundamental principle, I think, centers around this discussion of life. What is life? When does life begin? What constitutes human life? And these are not my original thoughts, obviously. This is kind of in the ether of the discussion around this whole thing. But it goes back to, now that obviously the preamble to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, those things are not part of the legal basis for our Constitution, but they are this foundation of how the framers of the Constitution thought. And so obviously this gets quoted a lot. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, people rightly say, well, that's the Declaration of Independence, that is not the Constitution, so you can't base law off of that. But part of this Roe v. Wade right to privacy, it kind of comes from different constitutional amendments, but one of them does come from the 14th Amendment, I believe it is, this due process clause, that does instantiate this idea of this right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'll read this part that's pertinent. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So this due process often gets thought about like in criminal cases. I have the right to liberty. The government can't take my liberty away without due process, right? They have to take me to court, find me guilty, all this kind of stuff, and then they can deprive me of my liberty. Same thing would be true of life. If a government has the right to capital punishment, why can a government take your life and deprive you of your right to life? Well, under due process, if they charge you with a crime that's violates the law severely enough, and they deem it's worthy of depriving you of your life, you have to go through due process, obviously. So, but this is one of the things that kind of this right to privacy bubbles out of. And so in here, obviously, I would think that the pro-choice people would say, well, see, under the law, it says all persons born have this right to life, liberty, and property. So if we want to look at, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created by their creator with certain unalienable rights. They're created equal. What does that mean to be created equal? Well, according to the 14th Amendment, it would mean that they were born. You have to be born to ensure these rights. Now, pro-life people would say, well, wait a second. You're really created at the point of conception, right? I mean, and this is really where things now have become very apparent as we've known more and more. Now, years ago, people knew, like, once a baby started kicking and reacting within the womb, people knew that there was life there. And now, especially with ultrasounds, you can look in there, and we know, like, really early on that, this looks like a baby. It appears to be a baby. It acts like a baby. You hear about, people, ultrasounds that show babies laughing and kicking and smiling and thumbs up, all these different kinds of things that little kids do. This is definitely life. Now, I don't think anyone denies that, right? That's why people often kind of, glibly say, well, if we found a fetus on Mars, everyone would consider that to be life. Well, of course, it is life. There's no denying that. I don't know that there's any person that would deny that the unborn human is a life. The question then comes, well, do they have any rights? And what rights do they have? That's really kind of this debate, but I think that we get so mired down in the law aspect of it, when already both sides, as has already been mentioned, both sides admit the law can get things wrong, right? And this is why people don't like when abortion gets compared to slavery, because slavery, rightly, is considered, such, a grave sin in American history. So people who are pro-choice don't like it being compared to slavery, because by and large, most people nowadays think that slavery was terrible. And if you think that abortion's good, how could you compare it to something so terrible? But there are so many parallels, obviously. We can look back and say, well, wait a second. People looked at, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Well, men, these slaves, don't count as people. They don't get rights. Women are not men. They don't get rights. We can look back and say, okay, well, hold on, wait a second. Any laws that would interpret the Constitution that way are clearly violative of these people's rights. That this is not okay to do this. So they got those things wrong. So we can't it's not sufficient to just point to the law and say, well, the law says X, Y, and Z. Which, as a side note, that's why this, I understand if you're fervently pro-choice, why this this decision that looks like it's going to come out of the Supreme Court would be so damaging, because before this, all you had to basically do was say, you can't tell me I can't have an abortion. It's my right. It's the law. I'm allowed to. You could just pass it off to, it's legal. Well, legal doesn't always mean moral or right, especially when we know that the courts can get things wrong. Laws that get set up can be wrong. There can be unjust laws. So you can't only point to the law, which I think is what most people always used to do. Yeah, I'm pro-choice. Why? Well, it's the law of the land. It's legal. You can't really do anything about that. Well, what this does is it removes that excuse. And now, okay, states can make their own laws. And if a state wants to make their own law outlawing it, well, guess what? You can't just say it's legal anymore. Now you have to argue the merits of the thing itself. Again, comparing it back to slavery, if slavery was just legal everywhere, you could just say, hey, it's legal. You can't tell me I can't do this. Once states and the federal government start outlawing a thing, then you can't just point to, well, it's legal anymore. The case has to be made that, hey, this is unjust. for you to outlaw this thing and to forbid me to do this. And if you try to, that's violative of other greater rights. So what's happening is it's forcing us into a discussion on the merits and the morality and the absolute rightness of this issue of abortion. Which, again, as somebody who's pro-life, I think that's a good thing, because I think that the pro-life argument is the right argument. And when you hear people have to make the pro-choice argument, to me it becomes very apparent that, wow, like we have very fundamentally different opinions on life, the value of life, and all that kind of stuff. So, when I've been thinking about this the past couple weeks, I've just been thinking about Thomas Sowell has a book called The Conflict of Visions. And in it he talks about the constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision. And it's really this two ways of looking at the world. I mean, it's not as simple as like conservative and liberal, but conservative would be kind of this constrained vision, liberal would be unconstrained vision. And what he talks about in there is this idea that conservatives have this view that humanity is a certain way. We are sinful, if you want to use biblical language. We're flawed. We have everybody has problems, and groups of people have large amounts of problems. So what we have to do is we have to have systems in place that curb against the evils and the sins of people to keep them in check. We've got to have prisons to put criminals away. We've got to have systems that find out who criminals are. We've got to have checks on those systems. So all this stuff is kind of, people are constrained by their limitations, and we have to work within that system. And this unconstrained vision is this idea that, it's kind of fashionable now to think that people are just good, that human flourishing is just a natural. People just tend towards good, tend towards flourishing, tends towards prosperity. So Rousseau, when he says man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains, this idea that there's nothing wrong with humanity, it's the chains and the systems that are put upon us. So if we can just tear those things down, the systems down, the institutions down, humanity will flourish. And again, the other vision says, no, if you tear down these systems, mankind will flourish, but mankind's flawed, so the flaws will flourish and explode and become more apparent. Now, those are two different visions, and depending on which vision you buy into is going to cascade and affect every other decision that you make, every subsequent decision you make on how you view systems and institutions and all of this kind of stuff. So I think the same thing is true in this abortion discussion, okay? So there are just different views on how to view the world, and this is why the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What that means is our founders were going to build a country and establish a constitution on truths that were self-evident. That means we don't have to prove them. Everybody knows them and everybody agrees to them. It's an axiom that everybody accepts. So everything that we build going forward, people in theory should be on the same plane because we're all starting from the same starting point. The problem now is we don't hold those truths to be self-evident. We're disagreeing on whether or not people are even created by their creator, whether they're endowed by their creator, right? So if you view I am endowed by my creator with these certain rights, that implies what? It implies my rights come from a creator. They don't come from the government. The government can't take away certain rights that are endowed to me by my creator. They can only protect them. If you don't believe you're endowed by your creator, you're naturally going to think, well, the government gives you these rights, and if the government gives rights, they can take rights, abridge rights, confiscate rights, whatever, expand on these rights. Whatever it may be, those are already two different opinions you might have if you don't believe that we are endowed by our creator. If we are not created. The other thing is we are created equal. That I think is the linchpin. The main point of division between pro-choice and pro-life is the created equal. Now, why do I think that? It's because what we're seeing with this discussion of abortion, people like to say, well, people who are pro-choice, they don't care about life, and then pro-choice people say people who are pro-life, they don't care about women's rights. So it's like black and white. I don't know any pro-life people who would say I don't care about women's rights or bodily autonomy. If you want to draw this along partisan lines, pro-life people tend to be conservative, and conservative people do believe in bodily autonomy, and we've seen that in the past 2 years, right? My body, my choice. They would kind of glibly say, using pro-choice talking lines to say, you can't tell me to wear a mask, you can't tell me to take a vaccine, you can't blah, blah, blah. My body, my choice, I have bodily autonomy. So it's not like they don't believe in bodily autonomy, they just think that it has its proper place. So they don't disagree with bodily autonomy or women's rights to their own body and all that kind of stuff. But these are competing values, right? These are competing virtues, and they're hierarchies. Every person has a hierarchy of values, what they consider to be more valuable and more precious, right? Okay, so we've talked about comparing it to slavery already, and people don't like that. Here's why I think it's important to compare it to slavery, in that what we're talking about is definitions of words, right? Are axioms that we agree on. And if we don't agree on the axioms, if we don't agree on the definitions, then we're going to have differences of opinions about how laws should be formed. You can imagine somebody saying, back in pre-Civil War America, I have the right to do with my property whatever I want. And everyone would agree with that, for the most part. It's mine. I can do it to this microphone, whatever I want to do to it, right? I can do it to my laptop, whatever I want. It's mine. It's my property. I bought it, or I made it, or whatever. I can do to it what I want. I have property rights, which would certainly be constitutional. The right to my life, liberty, and property. The fundamental disagreement would be people who are pro-slavery applied that to their slaves. Right? This is my property. I bought this property, and it's my tool that I use on my farm or whatever. Abolitionists would say, hold on, yes, you have a right to your own property. The problem is that person is not property, they're a person. We've got a more fundamental disagreement than do we have a right to property or not. See, so with this pro-abortion thing, well, you don't believe in bodily autonomy. Well, we're pro-life. Well, all these kinds of different things. You don't care about life. We're disagreeing on life and this inherent value of life, I think, is what we're disagreeing on. And what I mean by inherent value is just another way of saying created equal. Equal in life, equal in value, equal worth. We are all created in the image of God. It's not like the Animal Farm trope, that all people are created equal, some people are just more equal than others. We don't believe that in America. We are all created equal. We are all of equal value, right? Now, it's not a stretch to say that we would be a different country if that wasn't an axiom that our founding fathers believed in. If they did not believe in what they said in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. If they did not believe that, they would have founded a different country than we currently have. Right? So the point is, now in this divide that we are in our country, are we going to become two different countries? I mean, people are talking about that. This might be an issue just like the Civil War, where we are going to have to split. Because why? We are debating not just a law from 1968 about what the 14th Amendment or, whatever, blah, blah, blah. We are arguing about fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. We are arguing about fundamentally different inalienable rights and truths in which we hold self-evident. That's what we're arguing about. That's why this is such a crucial issue to discuss. the fight for abolition would not have happened if this wasn't instantiated in our founding documents. If we didn't say all men are created equal, there never would have been an abolitionist movement to say, hold on, wait a second. We have these foundational beliefs that all men are created equally. Why are these ones being treated worse than other ones, right? So that push for abolition came from this idea that, wait a second, we're not living up to our founding ideals. Same thing for the suffragist movement, fighting for women's rights. It's like, well, wait a second. It says all men are created equal, but clearly that means all people, all of humanity, right? So even that wouldn't have happened. We would have had a completely different country if we did not believe all men are created equal, and that is a self-evident truth. So we can see the divide in two different countries happening. We would have had two different countries, and now as we started to challenge those foundational beliefs, we do live ideologically in two different countries. Now, I want to just share this clip. It's been going around of Janet Yellen, U.S. Treasury Secretary. She was before Congress discussing. She wasn't even discussing abortion, but it ended up coming up because that's what everyone's talking about. So just take a listen to this clip of Janet Yellen before Congress.
If the draft of the court's majority holding in Roe versus Wade is the actual decision, what impact will the loss of abortion access mean economically for women?
Well, I believe that eliminating the right of women to make decisions about when and whether to have children would have very damaging effects on the economy and would set women back decades. Roe v. Wade and access to reproductive health care, including abortion, helped lead to increased labor force participation. It enabled many women to finish school. That increased their earning potential. It allowed women to plan and balance their families and careers. And research also shows that it had a favorable impact on the well-being and earnings of children.
So in that clip, she's talking about abortion. She's framing it in an economic light. She's framing it in a materialistic culture. Now, when you listen to that, it sounds terrible. And, she even says, I don't want this to sound harsh or whatever, but the reason it does sound harsh is because even pro-choice people, as much as the talking points that might be echoed, when you really press them to it, they say, well, wait a second. Are you really talking about let's abort people because it's good for the economy? That's such a cruel, it is eugenics. It's very Nazi-esque. It's very totalitarian, right? We've got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. We've got to sacrifice some people, which is why, again, from the biblical mentality, from the Christian mentality, that's why this is so horrible. Now we can fancy it up in kind of atheistic, materialistic language. We can talk about the economy and GDP and use words like fetus and all that kind of stuff. But from the Christian perspective, this is no different than the ancient Canaanite people sacrificing their children to Molech or to Baal. Now these false gods, were these statues, these bronze statues that they would heat up, till the metal was glowing hot, and there's the chantings and banging of drums, as they're worshiping Molech and Baal. And they would take the baby and then put the baby into the scalding hands of Molech and Baal until the child burned to death and died. And of course the drums and everything was to drown out the crying and the yelling of the child and stuff as it died. That's horribly atrocious. And that's barbaric and savage. But and people, we don't have obviously video footage of that happening, thank God. But it's not that the parents loved doing that. It wasn't like the parents were just like, this is great. I can't wait to sacrifice my child. Put me at the front of the line. to put my child into the scalding hands of Molech. I'm sure there was tears, weeping. I'm sure, like, probably the mother couldn't even do it. It had to have been the father who did it. The mom was too attached to the child, whatever. Like, nobody was jumping in line to do this. The reason why it was called sacrificing was, the point of this was this belief that if we sacrifice one child to Molech, he will bless the fertility of our country. We'll have more children. It's better to sacrifice one child and be guaranteed 10 by Molech than to keep my one and not sacrifice it and then maybe struck barren and not be able to have any children, right? So, and we want Molech to send rain. We want Baal to cause our crops to grow so we can survive and all this kind of stuff. That's barbaric and that's savage, but that's not any different thinking than we think now. Well, we need to abort this child in order to why? To have a better economic life. There are people who say, I would not be as successful in my career and in my life and have the career that I have now had I not had my abortion. That is no different than we would not have the 10 children and the thriving crops now if we had not sacrificed that one child to Molech. I mean, when we view the world in just this material, through this material lens, that's where we end up. It might not happen immediately, but that is where things inevitably go. And if you don't think that that slope will continue to slide, don't kid yourself. That's why this debate on wait a second, we have to draw a line somewhere. We have to draw a line. We cannot just talk about whether people are people because they're wanted or not. That's not acceptable. That will just slide down to, I'd made the case, and again, you can make the legal case, well, they were born, so they had a legal right to such and such. Remember, legal decisions can be wrong. Everybody agrees to that. So once we accept the fact that legal decisions can be wrong, then we can no longer just say, well, the law says that once you're born, you have these rights, because a further Supreme Court can just come down and say, well, we're going to change that a little bit. We're not going to say born. We're going to say once a person reaches a certain viability or some other, they could draw some other arbitrary line, whatever viability or whatever line they might draw. So courts can get things wrong. So once you start to go down that path of, well, it's not really very convenient to have this child right now, well, man, where does that line get drawn? Somebody like Andrea Yates, who drowns 4 of her kids in the bathtub, ages 7 and down or whatever. What if a parent has a 1-year-old and they're like, and I made the case, like, what about, like, everything that gets brought up, if a woman has been raped by her brother, so there's incest and there's rape and she's poor, and, throw all these things in there, and we say, well, she should have an abortion because, she'll be traumatized. And I certainly don't want to minimize any of that stuff, but I will say, as a side note, if that has happened to you, the trauma of what's happened doesn't go away because the child's no longer in the picture. You don't suddenly become unraped because there's not a child in the picture. So if you have a child and you're, if you decide, well, I was raped by my brother and I'm poor, but you know what, I'm going to carry the child to term, and then after about 5 or 6 weeks of having the baby, you were still raped by your brother, and you're looking at the child and you think, I can't deal with this. The trauma's too great. Every time I look at the child, I'm reminded of the rape that occurred by my brother and how poor I am. I can't care for this child or whatever. So I'm just going to put the child in a trash bag and put it in a dumpster somewhere. That's not acceptable, but you can see how when you view things just through a lens of this isn't convenient to do this anymore, how if you had legal protection to do it, why wouldn't people do it? So that's my point, is this is a question that the law can and needs to weigh in on, but the fundamental differences are what we are arguing about. Can you just view children as commodities? It's not convenient for me to have this child right now. I'm not in a place financially to have this child right now. All these kinds of stuff. So, Molech, Baal worship, they view people just as materials. And when you view the world that way, again, we're going back to just people who see the world differently. When you see children, people, human life, as just material, then that question of being endowed by their creator and that all men are created equal, that is a truth that is no longer self-evident. That is not true anymore because, if things are created equal, if that's what we're supposed to believe, well, here you've got two books, right? They're material things. That's all they are just material. They are not equal. They're different, and they're created differently. So to say these books are created equal, they're not created equal. And that is where, when you start to go down this path of just viewing people as material beings, you start to realize, wait a second, people aren't equal, right? And on a certain level, on a material level, that is true. There are no people who are equal. People are different. Every person's different. Even identical twins, while biologically equal, it's not too long before you realize, oh, these are different people. They have different makeup and personalities and stuff like that. But people are different. They are not equal. Some people are tall, short, fat, skinny, good-looking, ugly, smart, dumb. Nobody is the same. So when you start to realize, well, yeah, people really aren't equal. We're all created equal, but some are more equal than others. You start to realize, why shouldn't we legislate differently? Because people are not equal. People are not the same. And when you start to go down that path, when you start to view people only through that lens, that people are not equal, then you start to have value judgments. So going back to the book again, I know this is a simple illustration, but it's just right at hand. Now, these books are not equal. The content of them is different. The appearance of them are different. All that kind of stuff. These books are not equal. One is more valuable than the other. And not just a material standpoint. The information in them might be more valuable. So value then gets brought into this discussion. All right, we start to discuss the value of things. If things aren't equal, some things are more valuable than others. And I think at the point in which we are arguing about abortion, this is what we're arguing about, is value of people, okay? A conservative, somebody who's pro-life, I shouldn't even say conservative, because there are people who are not politically conservative, but who are still pro-life. People who are pro-life have a fundamental belief that all people are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain rights. There's no difference on that standpoint. There is obviously differences materially. But when you dispense with that self-evident truth, then you start to realize people are not equal. People have different value. And so the illustration that came to me to illustrate this. Now, I'm not saying that these two things are the same. I'm just only using this example to illustrate how we operate a lot of the times in the ethical realm with the value judgments we place on people. Okay. If somebody comes to your door, and movies and stories have been made about this, but somebody comes to your door and they say, hey, here's a button. If you push this button, somebody you don't die on the other side of the world, or somebody you don't know on the other side of the world will die, but you'll get $1 million. Somebody who's that just believes, as a fundamental belief, all people are created equal, would look at that and say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Well, what if we gave you 10 million or 100 million? No, I'm not doing that. But if you look in terms of value and relative value, what it means to me, what the value it brings to me, the worth that person is to me, then you start to question, well, I don't know that person. I've never met them. I probably don't know anyone that does know them. They don't bring any value to my life. They've never made me laugh or smile or be sad or brought me joy or showed me love in any way. They're not even really a person to me. Do they even really exist? I don't know. And so you're more apt to push that button because it's going to benefit me financially, and something happens to somebody who I don't know and really brings me no value. They mean nothing to me. They mean less than nothing to me. They're standing in between me and $1 million. So when you start to view people that way, that's the road you can go down. Is viewing people, they're not really valuable to me. Now, this is why, again, I think we operate this way, and we have to have as a foundational belief. Like, we have to almost, as an attitude of faith, because all the evidence to the contrary is some people are more valuable than others, to me, relative to me, people are more valuable than others. We have to have as an attitude of faith, this kind of self-evident belief that we all have, that no, it doesn't matter what I think about the person, we are all equal. Because people often say, well, a woman that miscarries, is that a loss of life? Well, and I know I'm treading on very dangerous ground here, and I don't want to speak out of turn. But you can see in the case of miscarriage, and obviously I'm not married, I've never had a child, but I've heard my pastor was talking with a couple one time who had a miscarriage. And the woman was grieving, and the man was kind of, not standoffish, but it wasn't as personal to him. And my pastor was explaining to him, listen, I know to you this isn't as heartbreaking as it is to your wife. The wife was taking it much harder than the husband was. And the husband admitted, you're right, it's hard for me to relate to her because I'm not grieving. Now, what has happened? Okay, a life has been lost, and the husband is not grieving as much as the wife. And the wife is probably not grieving as much. And again, I don't want to speak out of turn, and I'm just, again, I want to be sensitive around this issue. But probably not grieving as much or for as long as she would if, say, she had a 10-year-old child, and the 10-year-old child tragically died in this horrific accident. Okay, but there's still grief there. Well, why is there grief there? Because to the woman and her unborn child, a relationship has already formed. Now, it's not as sophisticated as maybe a relationship she would have with a 10-year-old child, which might be why the grieving is a little bit different. But that's also why the husband can't grieve in the same way as the woman has, because to him, again, going back to, and I'm not comparing them like they're apples and apples or whatever, but it's like the person on the other side of the planet, will you touch this button to get $1 million? Well, I don't know that person. I don't have any relationship with that person. So the husband is not grieving as much as the wife because he doesn't have a relationship with the unborn child, or he doesn't have as sophisticated or as intimate of a relationship as the mother. And then as the child is born, both parents start to have a relationship with this child, and that relationship matures and deepens and grows. And then when a child who's 9 or 10 or 11 dies, it seems more tragic because, wow, there's such a loss, right? There's so many people who were blessed by this life and had value poured into them by this person. The grief on a subjective level is greater because, oh man, this person who we valued so much, and again, I'm trying to use this language intentionally, we valued this person so much, they brought so much value to our lives, is now gone. The problem with the unborn is subjectively and relatively, they bring no value to people's lives. Now again, I'm talking like a materialist. Understand that. The father has minimal relationship. I mean, it's more of like a imagined relationship. There's not much until, once the baby starts kicking, that's why, the first time the father can feel the baby kick, that relationship starts to become real. Wow, there's actually a person there, or I can see them on the ultrasound or hear the heartbeat, But before, it's just like, it's kind of almost like an imaginary person. There's not really a real tangible relationship there. So it's an unsophisticated relationship. The husband doesn't grieve as much over a miscarriage, I think in part because we naturally gravitate towards thinking, that person didn't bring much value to my life. And again, we hate that we think that. And that's why I think that this is wrong to operate that way. Those are natural impulses we have, right? There's nothing, we can't get away from that. But why it's a tragedy when a woman has a miscarriage, whether you feel like it's tragic or not. Your feelings of whether it's tragic is because you might feel that that unborn child was not valuable. But somebody who's pro-life has as their operating principle that unborn child has been endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that child is created just as equal as I am. That child is equal in worth and value objectively and in terms of reality as I am. Okay? So a pro-life person has that, whether they realize it or not. That is why. That is the foundational belief that they operate from. And I think that pro-choice people have a different foundational belief. They no longer believe that to be a self-evident, inalienable truth that all life is created equal. And again, I don't know that all people think that through, but I think that they feel. That's why I think that pro-choice people can almost detach from the idea of abortion. They don't like to think about it, which is why I think that this decision is such a good decision. This Roe v. Wade decision is because now you can't just dismiss it and say, well, it's a legal issue, it's against the law to do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. Now you actually have to think about it and question your fundamental beliefs on abortion. What do I really believe when we've got now a person who is not equal to me as far as, we're not the same. This person is just an unborn whatever. They don't contribute anything. They bring no economic value to the world, any of that kind of stuff. I don't know them. I can just pretend they don't exist. I don't see them. They're out of sight, out of mind. You have to question, well, wait a second. Do I really believe that all people are created equal? And if I believe they're all created equal, when did that person become created? When were they created by their creator? Those are foundational questions that you have to ask and answer. And eliminating Roe v. Wade forces the discussion, which I think makes people uncomfortable, because it forces them to question foundational beliefs that they have. Do I believe that all people are created equal and that they are equal? And if so, when does that create? It doesn't matter what I feel. I might not grieve a miscarriage as much as I grieve a child that I have known for 10 years. That doesn't mean that the child that I've known for 10 years is more valuable than the unborn child if I believe that all life is created equal. These are foundational questions. And again, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm sure I made mistakes in my legal analysis. I'm not even an ethical or moral scholar in any way. I'm just thinking these things through and out loud, like I think all of us have to do. And I think all of us are now free to do. And that's why eliminating Roe v. Wade is allowing us to discuss these issues that I think are matters of life and death. We might disagree on the value of the life and the tragedy of the death, but these are questions of life and death, and they're questions that need to be hashed out, thought through, discussed, and really we need to come back to these foundational, unalienable beliefs that we all have, and that we need to operate from those inalienable, unquestioned beliefs, these foundational beliefs that we all have. Otherwise, we're living in two different Americas. And if we're living in two different Americas ideologically, eventually we're going to physically have to split and become two different countries because the center cannot hold. We will divide over this issue ultimately. So I'd love to hear your opinions on this issue. Obviously, everybody and their mother has an opinion on this issue. So feel free to comment, email, wherever you're seeing this. Let me know what your thoughts are. And I would love to have a discussion on this because I think that's the good thing that's coming out of this. Eliminating the Roe v. Wade question is forcing people to have to discuss this issue. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Have a good one. Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, You can text the word discipleship to 41444 or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Sotheby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissotheby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.